Well, unless you've been living under a rock, I'm sure you are aware that the Beatles' final song has been released, and it's called Now and Then. And I might be a little late to the game. You're already going to be able to find tons of videos on YouTube about this song, people recording their reactions to it, people reviewing it, people just saying all kinds of different things about this song. Well, what I'd like to do in this video is just analyze this song strictly from a musical standpoint. I'm not too interested in the lyrics. I'm not really a lyricist myself. When I write songs, I depend on someone to help me with the words. And I think just looking at the lyrics, they are kind of a throwback to early Beatles songs where the lyrics were very simple. And this song is very sentimental, very heartfelt as far as the lyrics are concerned. But I want to concentrate on the actual music and basically the chord progressions. What's interesting to me about this song is that it's very much in the style of John Lennon, the way he would write, especially when he wrote on the piano. Some of the most interesting things that Lennon wrote were written on the keyboard. Now, of course, he also wrote using the guitar because he was a very able rhythm guitar player. A lot of the Beatles also wrote using the keyboard, and so they were able to come up with some very interesting things. Most of you know the history behind this song, Now and Then. Lennon wrote this in the 70s. I think it was 1977. And he recorded a demo of it, just basically him at his piano, banging away, singing this song. It wasn't even completely finished yet. Some of it sounds like he was just kind of mumbling his way through it to get a structure going. So it's piano and voice together. And very often the sound is, he drowns his voice out with the piano. You know the history of this song. They originally wanted to include this on the anthology collections that were produced in the mid-90s. They did Free as a Bird and Real Love using Lennon's original demos that were recorded just him and a piano and his cassette recorder. It's interesting to listen to those two songs because his voice sounds kind of distant and murky, and they would try to pass that off by saying, well, Lennon liked to use interesting effects on his voice because he didn't like just the straight sound of his voice. Well, that's okay. We can let that go. These are very interesting songs to listen to, and they kind of give you a glimpse of what the Beatles would have sounded like had they stayed together past 1970. So they also tried to work on this song, but they couldn't get it to work because they just couldn't get the sound that they wanted. The voice was fading in and out. The piano was overpowering it. There was a hum in the background. Anyway, they had to abandon it, but McCartney specifically didn't want to let it go. He used to talk about it in interviews a lot, how he would like to come back and work on that song. And eventually the technology got to the point where they could do it. They were able to take that rough recording that Lennon made and extract his voice from it. That just amazes me that you can do things like that nowadays. I started working in recording back in the 70s when it was 2-inch analog tape, and you had to edit with a razor blade, and gradually worked on my way into MIDI and then eventually digital tape, things that looked like VHS tapes and so on, and then eventually into Pro Tools, which is what I use today. To be able to separate his vocal out like that is pretty amazing. And so once they were able to do that, they were able to use his vocal and then some of the guitar work that Harrison did in the 90s when they were trying to produce this song for the anthology series, and then they decided it wasn't going to work, so they let it go. They took Lennon's vocal, Harrison's guitar, and then in separate studios, Ringo added drums, McCartney added bass, additional vocals to help bolster Lennon's vocal where it may have faded a little bit. Then they added strings, which were arranged by Giles Martin, the son of George Martin. They added some backing vocals. They even pulled some vocals off of earlier Beatles recordings, which you can hear in there. And the result is something that really sounds like a Beatles song. That even though it was recorded across three decades, 2 centuries, you've got vocals from the 70s, guitar from the 90s, and then drums and more vocals and bass and strings from 2023, they put it all together and it really sounds quite nice. So I want to look at Lennon's chord progression because it is very Lennon-esque, if that is a word. Song starts out with an A minor chord and then goes to E minor over G. So immediately we have established that we are not in A minor, straight A minor, because if it was A minor, it would be this chord. Doesn't have quite the same sound, does it? So it goes to E minor over G, which puts us in the Aeolian mode. And so the E minor chord is basically the 5 chord of the Aeolian mode. And he plays it in first inversion. It's very much a thing that you would do composing at the piano. And he goes back and forth from A minor to E over G, and then he has the melody. I may not get the melody exactly right because I'm concentrating on the chords. Now it goes to F major 7, so we are still firmly in the Aeolian mode, but then the next chord is E7, so that suddenly puts us in straight A minor. And then we have an A sus. This is actually suspension with a sus 2 and 4. Once again, a very piano-based type suspension. And that whole section repeats. Very much a Lennon melody, too. Whoops. Can't talk and play at the same time. Now we go into the second section. This is where we get the now and then. But now we have a surprise chord. This is very much what Lennon would do. And then another minor chord. And then another minor chord. Now it sounds like we're trying to get into the key of G. A minor to D. But instead of going, that would be too traditional for Lennon. So he just goes back to A minor, and we're back in the Aeolian mode. There's a suspension chord again. And then we go back to this second section. There's that surprise chord. Back to E minor. Now we go into a bridge, and I think this was probably added by McCartney. If you listen to Lennon's original demo, this section is nowhere to be found. In fact, there is another section in Lennon's original demo where he actually goes to F sharp minor and begins wandering all over the place. They left that part out, and perhaps that was a good thing that they did, because it's hard to follow what Lennon is doing there. And I think he was just kind of feeling his way through at that point, trying to figure out what he wanted to do. So McCartney adds this very simple but very effective instrumental bridge. So he's and then this is where he plays the slide guitar solo that sounds like Harrison. And it sounds like we're in the key of C now, where we're Just going back and forth between the 1 and the minor 2. Then we go to E minor. Now we're back on the A minor chord. Then to D. This is like a cadence in the Aeolian mode again. And now we're back to the beginning. There's those modal chords again. And there's that E7, which takes us into straight A minor. There's this beautiful suspension. There's the modal chord, but then the 5-7 in A minor. So it's kind of just going back and forth between Aeolian mode and A minor. Very effective. Now here's the ending, the last couple of bars, where it just kind of takes that Aeolian mode feel and then throws in the 5-7 and condenses it down. So now the harmonic rhythm, which is the speed at which the chord changes, suddenly becomes twice as fast. And then it finally resolves to A minor. Now I have to admit that the arranger in me wanted to hear it end like this. And just have it end on the E chord. Not necessarily E7, but just E. However, they decided they wanted to resolve it back to A minor, which is where we began. And that works too. So there you go. That's basically how Lennon constructed his chord progression. It's very much a type of chord progression that one would write when you're writing on the keyboard. So what's my opinion of Now and Then? I like it. It's very poignant, very heartfelt. Some folks have interpreted the lyrics as almost a love letter to Paul McCartney and the rest of the Beatles. You know, if I make it through, it's all because of you. Admittedly, those are not the greatest lyrics ever written, but they're very sincere. At least they sound very sincere. And of course, I like the arrangement. The strings are reminiscent of what you might have heard on Eleanor Rigby. They have a little bit of that feel to them. Very nicely done. And of course, the actual sound of the recording is very much up to date. Even though the vocals were recorded in the 70s, some of the guitar was recorded in the 90s, and then the rest of it was recorded in the, what do you call this decade, the 20s? Anyway, it sounds really good. And it definitely sounds like a Beatles song. When the Beatles were really super popular at first, I was still just a kid. You know, I was 7, 8 years old when they were super popular. So I was never really caught up in Beatle mania. And when I really became aware of their music, it was 1970, and they were still together, sort of, and then, of course, they broke up very shortly after that. But as a child of the 60s, they were certainly part of the culture, big part. And as I was a teenager in the 70s, I was aware of their solo work. I remember when Ringo's big album came out in 1973, and he had the big hit Photograph and a few other big hits at the time. And it almost seemed like he was going to be the most successful solo Beatle at the time. Of course, Lennon came out with his own things. McCartney kept going and going and going, and he's even going to this day. And Ringo is still out there playing at age 83. It's really amazing. It just speaks to the power of music to keep you young and keep you energized. Because once you get that into your blood, the desire to go out in front of an audience and just make them happy and have a good time, That's hard to give up, and that's, I think, why McCartney and Ringo, Paul and Ringo, are still out there doing it. And who knows how much longer they will continue. So I've been very much aware of their work all the way through. I've never been a big Beatles fan as far as, I really love John, I love Paul. I've always been fascinated by the body of work that they created, just the music, the songs that they wrote, the records that they produced, the recording techniques that were created to serve the ideas that they came up with, the arrangements that George Martin created to complement their songwriting. Just, to me, that's all very fascinating. And that's why I wanted to take this final Beatles song and just quickly analyze the chord progression that Lennon used, because it's very representative of the types of things that he would write. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave those in the comment section below. I respond to every comment. I look forward to speaking to you in the next one.